We are out here today with Thomas Mlsna from the Untamed Ambition. We're kind of following him around on one of his clients' properties and just kind of observing, letting him educate us a little bit on his style of property management.
This is a year one, first ever cover crop planting in this food plot, or what will be a food plot this fall. Up until this point, it's been in a row crop oscillation between corn and beans. So I'd say this is pretty impressive. Looks really good. I mean, our target goal here is to build up biomass, increase the organic matter in the soil, and really start mining those nutrients and bringing them back up into that topsoil that's been depleted for the last couple decades. We got some buckwheat, there's a few different types of brassicas, a few different types of sorghum, some triticale, a good combination of biomass builders, nitrogen fixers in there. Got some different legumes in there with some peas and beans. Our target goal is to get into a rotation where we're chemical free, right? And this is year one. You can see, if you look in here, you'll see some grasses and stuff showing up, but the biggest reason the weeds show up to begin with is because there's some deficiency in the soil, or there's open ground and it's trying to heal that soil, protect that soil. So that's the main advantage of a multi-species cover crop blend like this, is you're balancing out the soil demands. Some of these plants are harboring certain nutrients, but they don't utilize them, and other plants are utilizing nutrients and they're leaving stuff behind. Most of your weeds that people battle year after year are usually an annual or a biannual weed. And with this thatch layer that'll be formed by terminating this cover crop, most of those weed seeds aren't going to be able to push through that. So they'll germinate. If there's any weed seeds sitting on the topsoil right now, they'll germinate. But you think of a seed, all it is a stored ball of energy, right? So a smaller seed doesn't have as much energy. And in order for that plant to actually grow, that seed will send a taproot down, get soil contact, if it's not already deep enough in the soil, and then send a growth upward, develop a leaf, and start to harness the sun's energy to actually process those sugars and grow. And if it can't push through that thatch layer, it essentially fizzles out and dies. So that's the goal. But again, the grasses are the hardest thing to get rid of in your food plots usually. So that's why Jeff will plant today, Eric will spray today or tomorrow within the next couple of days before the next crop we plant germinates. And then this whole thing will just slowly brown down as the next crop greens up and pushes up through it. So he's got the right setup here. When you put these water holes in, the ideal setup is to have them on somewhat of a gradual slope, obviously the downhill side, and then see he cut just this real minor trench here. So all that water that comes down here is channeled right into this. Biggest thing is keep them out of the sun so they don't dry up so fast, and have them in cover. This is a perfect spot where you already have a pinch point, and now you just made it that much better where those deer are going to want to transition here before they hit that plot.
Generally speaking, you're wanting to put these water holes in a transitional area before or after they're coming out of the food plot.
Correct. What this water hole will do here, and it's not going to be every single time, but if a buck is bedded down this ridge line, there's a good chance that he'll come through this way before he enters that plot, instead of just popping in that field in the random spot. So it's just one more thing to pull him through this area. It's another spot to get good inventory with a camera location. And then obviously having a tree stand in a pinch point like this with an attractive spot in the transition area heading to food in the evening is money. Also in the mornings with those bucks cruising. The long-term plan on this property is we're just kind of slowly taking away the row crop land. So he's got a farmer on lease or on contract right now, but we're slowly peeling that back. And this is a recently purchased farm, so he has to own it for a couple of years before he can enroll in CRP. But we're going to be adding CRP strips around the edge, and we're trying to brush out those edges and really build that edge habitat back. But one of the big projects we did on this property this winter, there used to be a ton of white pines across the top of this ridge. So we removed most of them, and as you can see, we created a barrier there. That's going to provide some screening for our access route to get to the other end of this ridge, But more importantly, it's gonna make those deer move through defined areas when they cross this ridge. They can't just go over in any random spot. So we try to utilize those pines instead of just pushing them into a pile and burning them. And they will break down over time, but the deer will get conditioned. We're gonna add some switchgrass screening along that access corridor. Not a giant fan of big switchgrass plantings, but for screening, it's fantastic. But this spot here, this is kind of our main destination plot on this ridgeline. So kind of a similar planting. This is a little bit different blend. This one has more standing grains in it, though it looks like the deer hammered most of the corn that was in there. Somewhat of a failure on the standing grain side, because our goal with this particular plot was to have a standing grain in here. But silver lining is it still produced a really good cover crop, and we still had full intentions of coming through here and putting that fall blend into it to have that green base in here. So it's not bad. You know, like I said, we're gonna miss out on our standing grains this year. It's just gonna change the timing of the attractiveness of the plot. But overall, I mean, you can see we've got great biomass. This is kind of the same situation as the other ridge. This is year one, planting a cover crop into what had been row cropped for many years. And relatively poor soil up here, to be honest. So it's good to see this level of biomass. This blend's a little different from the other one. You can still see the buckwheat in here. There's some different types of sunflowers in here, so you'll see taller sunflowers. There's the brassicas, there's forage soybeans, there's also vetch, some milk vetch in here, so we've got this as a nitrogen fixer. And yeah, there's other species in here too, so you know, again, the goal is to balance this out as opposed to having a monoculture of corn that's gonna suck all that nitrogen out of the soil and then trying to force open rows between, you know, 30-inch rows or, you know, traditional corn planting that's gonna fill in with weeds, and then we have to spray it and amend that soil. And, you know, you get in this perpetual state of chemical application, increases the acidity of the soil, so then you're out here liming every couple of years. And we can get away from that. Typically we lime the first year or two after our soil tests come back, and then we don't lime after that. We can take a walk down along the side and show you what we did this spring. Back to building that edge habitat back. We came in here and we peeled back the low quality trees along this edge. You know, a lot of box elder, some of the hickories and the elm trees, we peeled them back, and then we replanted this edge with native shrubs and mass-producing trees. You can see these shrubs here. This is dogwood in these, and the deer stuck their face right down in there and browsed it off. That one's browsed off flush with the top of the tube. We'll leave the tubes on for 2 to 3 years on the shrub tubes. That'll give the shrubs plenty of time to actually build their root system instead of getting browsed down. You can see, like I said, the deer have been browsing these off. The combination of the tube and the weed mat eliminates that competition, but it allows that plant to get well established. And then we'll take these tubes, once this plant's established, we'll pull them off, and then we'll plant more shrubs down the ridgeline and reuse the tubes. With the trees, we'll leave these tubes on until that tree outgrows it. And if you look on the back, these tubes are actually split. We'll leave it on until that tree pushes that tube open. That will prevent, you know, our tree grows up and out of that tube and starts producing the mass that we're targeting, and it'll prevent a buck from coming through and rubbing on that tree and killing the tree in the first few years we take it off. So we've got essentially 3 native shrubs between every tree. The trees are about 25 feet apart. And then what we did is we plant the trees. This whole edge is kind of mimicking a forest ecosystem with some control behind it, right? So every other tree is a canopy tree. Your taller trees that live a lot longer, like chestnuts. Most of these are chestnuts in this situation because this property already has plenty of oaks. So we've got a canopy tree every 50 feet, and then every 50 feet, but in between those, so 25 feet, every 25 feet there's a tree. In between the canopy trees, we have understory trees with apples and pears. And we'll add more variety to it as time goes on and other plantings, but Japanese beetles like this chestnut. This is a 2-year-old chestnut here. So
It's doing well.
it's doing real well. And these tubes, you know, the thing with the tubes, they cut the wind down. This is something people take for granted. You know, it creates a greenhouse effect and obviously protects that young growing tree. But the biggest thing that's overlooked is it cuts the wind down. And most plants don't effectively photosynthesize when wind speeds are above 9 miles per hour. So this allows this tree to grow during all hours of the sunlight during the growing season without any wind issues at all. And then with the trees, you know, and the same with the shrubs, but really with these trees that are trying to establish a big broad root system, that weed mat, it's a plastic weed mat, it's impermeable. So what it does is it'll force that tree to grow its roots out wider a lot faster to seek the added moisture content in the soil. But at the same time, when it rains and that water flows underneath, it holds that moisture in there. We've got chestnuts along this row that are strategically picked by their genetics to drop at certain times of the year. And we planted them appropriately, where we've got late dropping chestnuts closer to the blind and the early dropping chestnuts towards the middle of the field. So we've got chestnuts dropping from August all the way through December. We're gonna walk over here and take a peek at a bedding area that we improved this winter. This is a doe bedding area. That's the primary objective for this. We want to try to hold those does close to the food. They already want to be as close to the food as possible, but by improving a bedding area where they want to be, ensures that they're going to stay nice and tight to that food, which gives our bucks plenty of space in the deeper parts of the property. So this is the middle of that bedding area. Again, really designed to be a doe bedding area more than anything. And one of the big things you'll notice if you look back at those yahoos there, trying to hide. We left cover there. We laid some trees down to create a good edge while those edges fill in. But if you look around, we essentially removed every tree in this bedding area except for the oaks. And we did actually remove some of the oaks. So you'll notice the sun's shining in here. There's lots of growth. That's what we want. You know, 80 to 85% of a deer's diet comes from browse. So you really need to focus on the browse in the woods. And then those food plots out there, what we've been talking about most of the day here, that's really just to supplement the browse and move the deer through areas that we can hunt. You can see the stump growth. I mean, this is pretty good. Year one regeneration. Looks like a box elder stump. You know, those deer are gonna come through here this winter and hammer this. And we laid some of these logs here. This was one of the key things of this particular bedding area. We had to make a mess on this side because our access route is at the bottom of this hill to get up to that box blind. So the last thing we wanted was those does to bed right on the edge of this hill and stare at that access route. So we purposefully forced them up onto the hill a little bit more, create better beds on the other side. The biggest thing that I always focus on is the topography, right? Topography is the greatest form of cover out there, and the deer will utilize that topography. You don't have to have browse in your bedding areas to hold deer there. They just need the cover. The browse just makes it that much better and ensures that they're there a lot more consistently. So this particular area, we literally just went out to the end of this little knob here and opened it up around that top topo line, you know, that military crest of the hill. And the other thing is when you have that topography, you want to look at the angle of the sun. So, you know, we opened it up a lot more on this side because that's south, so that's going to allow the sun to come back in here and get back in, where on the other side, it doesn't pay to open it up as much because the sun's not going to shine from the north anyways. You can talk about this for a second. So we've got an existing tree stand here. Not the best spot to hunt. You know, probably great for one sit, but if your timing's not right and the deer come from the wrong direction, you're putting a lot of pressure in your bedding area. Far better off sitting on a transition area coming or going from this bedding area. This looks like a cherry stump regrowth. You can see the deer already browse that off. But again, they'll hit that really hard this winter. Lots of good shrubby growth in here. we're walking through here, but a deer lives at this level. So, you know, from this vantage point, there's a lot of really good dense cover, but there's still some very clear trails and corridors so a deer can get in and get out without problems. And that's probably a big thing to highlight in here as well is, you know, we fell these trees somewhat strategically, right? We're not trying to overcomplicate things by any means, but we didn't want to just make a big gnarly mess in here. There's a clear path, multiple paths to get in and out of here. So this was kind of just left fallow. This was all farmland that just kind of went fallow after,
Okay.
you know, they got done farming it, and then I think it changed hands a couple times before this client purchased it. And ultimately, we are going to put it back, certain areas back into CRP.
Okay.
This winter, maybe even this fall, we're going to start logging this. The whole thing's in MFL,
Okay.
closed MFL. So we've already walked it, put together our habitat plan, mapped out, you know, our strategic bedding locations, and obviously the food plots and stand locations, basically looking at where the most accessible pinch points are, right? And then we always try to build off of those. So the next thing is we're gonna get out here. I'll actually be here probably next couple weeks, and we're gonna scout the areas that we're gonna log and actually look at the oaks in there.
Okay.
And determine, you know, if we have 2 oaks and we want to leave one, we want to make sure we're not pulling the oak that has the more productive oak with the most nuts on it, because 40% of your oak trees produce 70% of the nuts.
Right.
So we don't want to pull those genetics out of our timber stand, and also we obviously want that hard mass in there for the deer. But that's going to be bedding. That's all going to be native grasses. So again, this is fallow. I mean, you see a lot of goldenrod, and there's some milkweed here. The milkweed really shows up because we sprayed this once this spring to kill off the grasses. The grasses have filled back in since, but this is ultimately going to be a swath of switchgrass. And you can kind of see this trail here in the middle that didn't get sprayed. You know, the same down there. So we're just trying to create higher cover screening to get access into some of these back corners. And then the rest of it, we're gonna plant a prairie blend, but have more warm season grasses so we get better structure, better cover out here. You can see the food plot, how it comes to a V. So that pulls deer off those back corners. And then where the tree tubes are, we're building an edge there.
Okay.
You know, you see these edges here, how nice and brushy they are, right? And I'm sure you've seen it time and time again, where when you have those fence rows that go over hills, the deer love to follow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you literally can draw a line across an opening, and if you create cover on that line, those deer will follow that. They always follow the cover. So we build off the topography. You know, again, topography is the greatest form of cover. Build off the topography, add in this edge, same concept as Eric's property, where we do I refer to them as an orchard edge. Mm-hmm. Forest canopy or forest ecosystem type structure, creates more cover. That will fill in and isolate that bedding area. And again, we're gonna plant that to native grasses so there'll be better cover there. And those deer are gonna wanna bed up on that high point. You know, in the wintertime, they can go just over the backside of that hill. It's really good thermal cover, so they'll be in a spot where the sunlight hits the ground, but the wind is cut. Mm-hmm. And that's where they're gonna wanna spend a lot more time. I mean, they already bed back there quite a bit, but right now with what's currently growing in here, where you really have a base of mostly cool season grasses. Mm-hmm. As the fall progresses, most of those grasses just kind of slowly lay down, so they lose that cover. We've got this food plot here, pinches, and there's a pond just over that hill, and then a narrow meandering food plot that sneaks down around this corner. You know, so we're trying to just get deer to flow on this property and not sit in one spot. We're standing next to another large pond, but this one's out in the open. As you can see, it's hot, sunny. You know, it's not gonna hold water as well, and it's just not secluded. So that's what the tubes are. These are all shrubs, native shrubs. There's a lot of dogwood, high bush cranberry, some willows, and some other things in here. You know, again, the idea here is just to create a lot more cover, a lot more thicket of cover around here. Then we got that tree line behind us, tree line here. When this all fills in, it's gonna be a real nice secluded food plot or travel corridor for those deer. The other thing too that you'll notice if you look in the woods, and this is pretty typical throughout the Midwest, throughout the driftless region, is when they farm these areas, you know, they just push closer and closer to the edge of the ridge. So in some spots, there really isn't even enough real estate between the field or the opening here and the woods to create a travel corridor in the woods. So those deer bed in the back, and they either have to drop down in the valley and cross and come up, or you give them some cover and a reason to be up here, i.e. the food source, and then they travel up here a lot more consistently. And then the pond creates an attraction, gives them one more reason to flow through this corner, again, instead of dropping down. And this is a good pinch point here. There's a pretty good ravine or washout there. You can see the tree stand in the woods there. So all the deer movement that comes through this area is bending around this corner. You push your scent right down that ravine. Once we get this filled in with the natives, get more cover, create more consistent movement through here, we're gonna plug a box blind here with a tower. Because the crown of that hill and how that topography lays out, it's hard to really have one good setup where you can see everything that's going on back here. You know, a guy can sit in that tree stand and cover this side really well, but he's blind to what's happening on that side of the hill. So that's where the box blind comes into play. And then the other thing with a box blind that's nice, particularly in this situation, is a box blind will allow you to hunt a lot of different wind directions, right? It cuts down that wind moving freely over your body, so your scent dispersion's reduced dramatically. And now a guy can slip in, relatively easy access, pop in the back door of that blind, get up here, look right down both sides of this ridge, see everything that's going on. You know, it's a great bow hunting setup as deer move through here. At the same time, it's gonna be a fantastic muzzleloader or rifle setup because you can see all the way down this ridge line. And if we have that blind placed correctly, we can see out that way as well. My philosophy on hunting properties is so simple. We wanna do everything we can to give deer and all this other wildlife a place to live, an attractive place to live. And then we simply avoid doing the things that push them away.
They're more apt to spend more time on your property, which is giving you more opportunity to kill them.
Correct. That's exactly it.
Yep.
The more time they're there, the more opportunity you have.
Absolutely.
You know, I tell guys all the time, I always try to break it down, those 4 key elements that you probably hear me talk about: wind, pressure, food, and timing. The 4 most critical elements in your habitat, you know, how your habitat lays out, or just trying to figure out what a deer is doing at any given time. Wind, pressure, food, timing. You don't have control over the wind. Wind is king, right? You have to obey the wind, you work with the wind. The wind dictates a lot of what those bucks do. But you oftentimes, when you own your own property, you have control over the pressure and you have control over the food. And the timing is something that, you know, you have control over certain aspects of that, but for the most part, you kind of just look at the timing of how things happen on your property and build off of that. When you don't have control over the pressure and you don't have control over the food, your window of opportunity shrinks down. That analogy that I use where it's like trying to duck hunt out the chimney of your cabin.
Sure.
Right? You have a very narrow window of opportunity. If you pull the trigger too soon, you ruin your whole season.
Right.
If you pull the trigger too late, you miss the opportunity, right? When you control the food and move deer through areas that you want them, the huntable areas, and you control the pressure and you allow those deer to be there without interrupting what they're doing.
And you're creating that bedding habitat where you want them to be.
Exactly. Then you dramatically expand that window of opportunity.
Absolutely.
And now you can see them coming and pull the trigger when you want to pull the trigger. And also at the same time, you can see a bigger field of view. So that one buck that you see, might, you know, he might be your target buck now, but maybe there's better options. You know, instead of taking that 4-year-old this year, now you have 5s and 6-year-olds.
Tell me a little bit about your background. You're clearly very knowledgeable about what's going on out here. What made you want to get into this and do what you're doing?
My background's probably a little different from a lot of other consultants out there, right? I didn't get into this specifically for the hunting aspect of it. I grew up on a farm, right? I grew up on a large dairy farm, still a very active dairy farm. And then when I left the farm post high school, I actually went to college for wildlife biology. So my connection to the land goes pretty deep and everything on it. You know, I was one of those kids that spent more time in the woods than anywhere else. Sure. If I wasn't working, I was usually running off into the woods someplace. And that's where my passion really lies, is really trying to ensure the future of this going forward for my kids, for your kids, for all these next generations. But I kind of pivoted more in the hunting community. One, because I love to hunt, right?
Sure.
And I love to kill big deer.
And you've killed some big deer.
Killed a few nice ones, yeah. But I look at this, and similar to what you guys do with land guys, your clientele, people that want to invest in land and improve land and see that land thrive and utilize that land. I look at it from a little bit different perspective. I see all these issues. My background in biology, my farming experience, I see what works, what doesn't work, what's sustainable, and what's certainly not sustainable. And I truly believe that hunters, the land-owning hunters specifically, can make a huge impact. The land-owning hunters are one of the few demographics of people willing to invest time and money into something. From their perspective, it's for recreation, but they're investing in something that's truly protecting it for the wildlife. Mm-hmm. So that's where my passion really lies, is working with that type of clientele. And again, my background has kind of just led me down this path where it just works out that way. I mean, there's no one else out there that relies on the land as much as a farmer, sure. Right? But your entire livelihood sure. And your entire life has to do with the health of the land. Mm-hmm. So I've seen that, and I still see that. It's a dairy farm. It's a very productive dairy farm. And I take a lot of things from that, my experience with that, and how do I relay that to a hunting property? So that's my background. Worked with clients throughout the entire Midwest. I travel throughout the entire Midwest. Sometimes it's an on-site. Most of the time they're on-sites, but a lot of times we do just virtual consultations. We're trying to educate people. We're just trying to work with people to improve their property because I want to see this for generations.